This is the greatest car I've ever owned.
The 917 was the pinnacle of racing in that era, and it was the best Porsche ever made.
A very fast machine, extremely fast.
There's no car that you walk into your garage that stops you cold like this car.
I know it's in the top 100 cars of all time. Magic's never went down with this car.
What's up, everybody? I'm Chris Jacobs, and I am so stoked to be here with this movie star. This is the hero car from Steve McQueen's 1971 film, Le Mans. This legendary race car was purchased new from the Porsche factory by Steve McQueen and then driven by him in the film Le Mans. It later went on to have a successful racing career, ended up in the collection of a comedy legend, and now will be crossing the Mecum auction block in Kissimmee 2025.
The thing I love the most about Porsches is I love the story of how they started so small and grew so quickly. And there are cars that I call them moment cars. There are moments when things just landed perfectly. It happens in lives, it happens in cultures, it happens in stories. So to me, the 917 is the moment of Porsche where all their work and expertise came together.
Well, the 24 Hours of Le Mans is the most famous long-distance race in the world, and if not the most famous race in the world.
You know, Porsche was doing well in racing in the 50s and the 60s, but they always had this one race that they wanted to be on the top step of the podium, and that was the 24 Hours Le Mans.
Ford won Le Mans in 1966 and 67 with their giant 7-liter engines. So the FIA and, of course, Ferrari, Porsche, all the European manufacturers, they all said, we must stop this, we cannot have this. And so the rules changed, and the big engines were out completely for 68. And so if you built a prototype, which is what the Porsches were, then you could only 3-liter. But if you built 25, then you could have a 5-liter engine. And at that point, Ferdinand Piëch, the racing manager for Porsche, went into action, and he nearly bankrupted Porsche, building, 25 917s.
But if you want to look at just sheer racing, sheer engineering, with only one objective, to go fast, this was it right here. This was the purest, most unadulterated point to me in the history of long-distance racing, when the only thing that mattered was what was there in the metal, in the flesh.
The 917, which is a 600 horsepower fire-breathing dragon, it's like one of those dragons from Avatar. The crazy thing about this car, which is a 240-mile-an-hour car, is like every other Porsche, it's pretty easy to drive.
Well, here we have Porsche 917K, K meaning short tail, as opposed to the long tail. And this particular car, number 022, was bought by Solar Productions for the film Le Mans with Steve McQueen. And it replicated, as mentioned, Joseph and my race car. And I drove this car during the filming of Le Mans. So to see it now, beautifully restored by one of the best restorers in the business, Joey Cavalieri, let me tell you, better than new.
In 1970, when they ran the 24 Hours Le Mans, they had 3 John Wyer prepped Golf 917s.
When you saw how many cars were in that race, and how many of them were Ferrari 512s, and keep in mind, Ferrari had pretty much, for many years, been the dominant force in long-distance racing. That was the point in time when Porsche became the giant.
I really only drove one a couple of times. I'd driven for the Wire Gulf Ford GT40 team for 2 years, 68 and 69, when they did ask me to drive the third car at Le Mans with Mike Hailwood in 1970. And of course, Le Mans in those days was extremely fast with no chicanes. It was a 4-mile straight. And the car seemed to handle pretty well to me, and it was going well, and we were humming right along. And now the two lead cars had 5-litre engines. Our car had a 4.7-litre engine, and the car that ultimately won, Richard Atwood's car, also had a 4.7-litre engine. All 3 factory cars dropped out, and Richard and Hans Hermann, they won the race, and it was the first time Porsche had ever won it overall. And it put them right back on the map and at the head of the sports car field, so it really boosted sales of the regular street cars, the 911, enormously.
When we come back, Steve McQueen takes his passion for racing to the next level and begins production on a movie about the famed endurance race, the 24 Hours of Le Mans.
Mecum Auctions, the world's largest collector car auction, returns to Kissimmee, January 7th to the 19th at Osceola Heritage Park. Join us for the fun, fast-paced, high-energy Mecum experience with 4,500 vehicles up for auction. For avid collectors, first-time buyers, and enthusiasts of all ages, there's something for everyone. Bring home your dream car. Register to bid and buy spectator tickets now at Mecum.com.
In the spring of 1970, Steve McQueen was coming off a very impressive second-place finish at the 12 Hours of Sebring. But the wheels were already in motion for him to make a movie about the ultimate endurance race, the 24 Hours of Le Mans.
In the 1960s and 70s, Steve McQueen, he transcended from a TV star to a movie star, and then he became a megastar and actually made some of the biggest box office hits.
When I was a kid in the 60s, all we cared about was cool guys and how can we be more like them. And we had Muhammad Ali, George C. Scott, we had just millions of these guys. We had Sean Connery, and we had Steve McQueen. And he was that guy, like the way he walked and the jackets. For me, like, I want to be like that.
My grandfather, Steve McQueen, he was an icon in both motorsports and in cinema. He was so ahead of his time when you look at everything that he did. He was so authentic, and he fought so hard for everything that he believed in.
Film star Steve McQueen is preparing a Le Mans epic for 1970.
He went a little bit rogue, and he starts his own production company.
In 1970, they filmed the 24 Hours of Le Mans.
And I know that a lot of people have tried to make motor racing films, and they're very difficult to make.
The script wasn't quite there. Organizing these drivers and keeping these cars running, but the footage is incredible. The racing footage is incredible.
The pay was pretty good, you know, the daily pay. Everybody else was doing it, and so you might as well be there. But it was boring because you'd get there at 8 in the morning, you'd wait all day until the light was right. You know, the sun was in the right place. And of course, because it rained in the race, they had to wet the roads with water trucks. So these water trucks are going, and the whole thing was, it must have driven Steve absolutely crazy.
When you see what my grandfather went through to get that film and that project made, there was no stunt drivers, there was no CGI. It was all filmed at speeds with him in the car and the real professional racers. It was so authentic.
The whole movie is in the car. You know, if you like the movie, when you see this thing in person, it's like you're in the movie. And that's exciting. I mean, to me, the reason you get into cars is to get excited.
022 then had an interesting racing career in 1971 with Willie Cowson and Reinhold Jost.
They proceeded to race it in the same series, Championship of Makes, we called it, the long distance racing. And they raced it in the 1971 season. They raced this car as far away as Argentina and Buenos Aires. They raced it at the 1,000 kilometers of the Nürburgring in 1971. They won their category at that race. What happened after that was rather interesting. They had it at a shop in Germany. Then it wound up being bought by Brian Redman, who himself had raced during the era of these cars.
I was friendly with a remarkable character called Vasek Polak. He became the first all Porsche dealer in America, and he had two 917s. There was another guy in Palm Springs, Jerry Enton. He'd been a racer, he'd raced Can-Am cars, and I told Jerry that ever he heard of a 917 for sale to let me know. So he rang me one day, a couple of years later. He says, Vasek's been to Munich and he's made a very low bid on a 917. Go over there and get it. And shot off with my Land Rover and open trailer to get it. I paid about $18,000 for it. So.
His wife wanted to buy a house, so they sold this car, I think, for $49,000 to Richard Atwood.
And Richard Atwood is most famous for winning the 1970 24 Hours Le Mans in a 917.
He vintage raced it a few times, he showed it a few times, and he owned it quite a few years. In the year 2000, Dick Atwood decided to sell the car. He shipped it to the USA. I said to Jerry, hey, this 917 that belonged to Steve McQueen, it's going to Monterey. They're going to be selling it. I think it's a car that you should consider.
So with 917022 making its way to the US, how would the stars align for Jerry Seinfeld to become the next owner? That story next on Mecum Presents Steve McQueen's Porsche 917K. From film star to race car, the story of Steve McQueen's 917K would eventually jump into the world of highly sought-after collector cars.
In the year 2000, Dick Atwood decided to sell the car. It was purchased by a gentleman by the name of Frank Gallagly, a well-known Porsche collector. 8 months later, I got a call and they said, hey, you know, we're selling that 917. Would Jerry possibly be interested? We rendezvoused at Willow Springs Raceway. Chad McQueen joined us, Steve's son. He put the car through its paces so that Jerry could see it driven in anger. And that was the moment the deal was made. Jerry bought the car.
It was the perfect combination of tying legacy and history. There's a story my dad tells back to legacy. When he was on the set of Le Mans, he kept begging my grandfather to take him for a ride in that 917. And so one of the final days of filming, my dad was on the Mulsanne there, and my grandpa pulled over, and he waved him over, and he put my dad on his lap, and they went around Le Mans. So my dad was 9 years old driving to Le Mans. You know, fast forward to that day with Jerry, my dad got to do the same exact thing with me. It's really special, that car especially, right? The 917, it was such a iconic time in my grandfather's life, and my dad's especially. I think, you know, when we speak about Le Mans, it's really where my family's love of racing developed.
The significance it has in the Porsche story, if you had to pick out one car to say, well, this is where these guys, they made it. You know, I mean, like with me, I was a very successful comedian before I got my TV series. But you would look at the TV series and go, well, that's where it came together. You know, if you're a fan of those iconic moments of the 60s, to me, this is the ultimate car of the Steve McQueen's legacy and Porsche's.
I've been working on cars for Jerry's collection since about 1997. A car comes to you and the decision has to be made, where are you going to put the car back? What period of time? So this car is 50 some odd years old, right? So it had varied history. Its initial history is where Jerry decided to go.
But we also wanted to make the car better and improve on things. So we needed to do an engine rebuild. It was due for that just based off of time and things wearing out.
I really respect that, you know, he is very supportive of making sure that the car, first of all, he wants a sound car, and it's in everybody's best behalf, but beyond that, going to the extent of making it is accurate for that period of time that we're picking. Not every owner will do that, it's costly, but the end result is something that we can all be proud of.
During the restoration, we discovered a lot of interesting things about the car that we didn't know before. We actually discovered more camera mounts, some switches for cameras that were in the cockpit, and we actually saw a lot of the old liveries that were underneath the paint that we were working with. So when we were sanding down to smooth out some of the fiberglass or something like that, we saw several of the old liveries confirming the car and its origins and all of the liveries that it ran throughout its life. So not only do we have an amazing paper trail and photo trail of this car's life, but we saw that physically in the paintwork and during the restoration.
It had been painted in Gulf colors and it had its decals, but it wasn't really accurate. And that's a huge undertaking in itself. Quite a few hours were spent in the layout of not only the orange and the blue and white number circles, but many sizings of printing out decals and numbers and scaling from period photographs to get it as accurate as it was.
It's in the Gulf Oil livery. That is the most noticed race car livery ever.
There's something about the colors, the light blue and the orange, and there's something about that number 20 that has always been a thing for me. I've always loved that number since the 60s and this car. I think it's the most iconic livery ever put on a race car.
Under Seinfeld stewardship, McQueen's 917K only increased its status with collectors and automotive enthusiasts. When we come back, Mecum Auctions reveals the next chapter for this automotive icon. Welcome back to Mecum Presents Steve McQueen's 917K. Well, this year's Mecum Monterey had a very, very huge announcement. Fitting that it be in California, that this movie legend be revealed again and announced for auction.
There's a lot of cars have been in the movies, but there's very, very few where the car is an equal star with the actual performer.
One of the things that I love most about this car and doing the research is just the chain of ownership is so complete. Where it has been is so complete. Photos basically throughout its life are available, and so there's no break in the ownership.
There's only one car that filmed the movie Le Mans that Steve McQueen bought new as a real 917. This was the car you see in the movie. I just think the next owner is starting off with something that when he receives it, no holes were barred in bringing it back to what we felt represents what the car was when it filmed the movie Le Mans.
In my opinion, this is, besides being the most valuable Porsche in the world, I think it is the single most important Porsche in the world, because any collector, any historian who wants to sum up the brand, this represents the brand more than anything, more than what came before it, more than what has come since, and I'm confident more than what will ever come. You can't go back in time and rewrite the book. This wrote the book.
Sure, there are other 917s that have won Le Mans or have better racing history, but none have the same ownership history or certain provenance that this car has. And now with the restoration and the way it's presented, it doesn't get much better.
You know, there are objects that have great value, and then there's objects that you really can't place a value because they evoke so much. If you're in the car hobby, you pursue these cars that give you a special feeling of excitement. I would say it's the automotive equivalent of sitting behind the Resolute desk. It's like, wow, this is where it's at. A lot happened here, you know. So that's how I look at it, you know. It's one of the few cars that has a historical significance beyond its automotive significance.
It's tremendously hard to value it, the history and so on and so forth. The great men in their industries that have owned it, nobody's really owned it for the monetary value. They've owned it because it's what they loved.
I've won some awards for some stuff that I've done, but that car to me was my real award. That meant to me that I did something good in my field, and I never cared about the bowling trophies with the guy holding the globe and the lightning bolts coming out the back. I don't know, you know. But the 917, to me, that's my Lifetime Achievement Award. At a certain point, I don't know what it is, I just felt like it was just time to move on, and I wanted somebody else should enjoy it. I think because, you know, generationally, the guys that loved Steve McQueen and loved 917s, those guys are still around, and someone else needs to enjoy this.
It's going to be emotional to see that car go off the block. But on the other side, it's a chance for another person to experience and carry forward this legacy that my grandfather and my dad cared so much about, and it really springboards it to a new generation, right? You know, it brings my grandfather and the car right back in the spotlight.
If you're a Porsche guy, this will be the centerpiece of any collection forever. This puts you in the elite crowd. It's like being in the GTO club in the Ferrari world.
A lot has to come together for something to be a great thing. My personal opinion is this particular car is just one of the great objects humans made in the 20th century. I think it's maybe the object of the 20th century, if you're a car person and you appreciate mechanical culture.
My grandfather was a fan of engineering, speed, power, and that's what Porsche stood for. And the 917 was the pinnacle of all of that. This is the best Porsche ever made.
From an icon of the acting world to a legend of the comedy world, a new chapter for this car will be written in 2025 in Kissimmee as Mecum sends this hero car across the auction block.